Okay, so for part 2 in Unit 3, we're going to look at trying to detect collisions. So as we're walking around and bumping into things, colliding with them, and how to collect those collisions. So again, we've got our first-person controller, and that's got this character collect and drop uh, script on it, and then we have our gem, and the gem has a gem collection script on it. And those are the scripts we're going to be modifying. So again, you might want to pull the source code um, for these that's posted. These are just the little gist versions of it, but we're going to grab these, an on collision enter and an on collision on trigger enter. And we're going to look at those two different ones for the gem script. So I'm just going to grab those from here, go to my script for my gem collection. So far I've got a start, an update, a fixed update. I'm going to add in these two. So there's an on collision enter, and it provides us a collision, and right now we're calling that variable collision, and an on trigger enter, and we have a collider. It's a slightly different object, and we have an other. Collision objects, this collision object gives you a lot of information about the point of contact between those two objects and how you collide with it, where you hit, how many times you hit it, and that sort of stuff. Trigger is less. You just get a pointer to the other object's collider, basically. And likewise, I can do the same thing with the character controller. I'm going to look at the on collision enter and on trigger enter for that. And I'm actually just going to post, for now, just going to post, copy those same things in here. I'm just going to change that we're doing these are in the character. So I'm printing those out. I'm also then displaying what we're colliding with here, what the other game object is that we're colliding with, and printing those out. So I've got both those. So now we can run this. I've saved them both, and we can run this and look for triggers or collisions. So I'm going to run this. I'm going to walk ahead and try to bump into things. And oops, I should have my console up too, but I don't. Here's my console. Nothing has shown up here other than the start methods that both started up. None of the collisions happen. And that's one of the problems with the first-person controller. The first-person controller doesn't do collisions very well, and generally I will recommend beginning programmers might not use this first-person controller. It does have a special event that you can work with called on character controller. And so I can add that to here, and I can do a debug and specify that information here. And its default parameter is called hit. Again, although I could change it, but this is called on controller collider hit, is when the controller hits something else. And again, it's only available on the character controller. It doesn't show up on these other objects. So if I try to run this now with that on character controller collider hit, I'll see that I do a lot of collisions here. In fact, I'm routinely always colliding with the floor. And then if I go and hit the gem, I will see hits with the gem. Let's see if I can scroll up and see those here, where I am colliding with the gem. But it's only the character controller that's printing these out. So this information is being shown here. It's not the gem. Even if I put that code here, it does nothing. This collider hit only is called in the character controller stuff. So I'm going to delete it from the gem stuff. Now, if I want to actually use this here and see this more, I can actually do some checking here. I can rather than, I'm going to ignore when I'm touching the floor. And so I'm going to say, well, the game object is named the floor, or while it's not named the floor, then print it out. And then I should be able to run this. Don't want to run it there. I often do that by mistake. I want to make sure I run it here. So again, then I don't get any collisions until I get into a gem, and then I'll get some. And then if I hit the gem again, I'll get some more. Okay. So there's some issues with the first person controller. So we're going to stop using that. I'm going to leave it here, and I'm just going to disable this. So in the first person controller, I'm going to uncheck this active button here. So it'll still be there, but not active. And I'm going to go back to my standard assets, go into my first person controller, prefab, and grab this rigid body controller and put that up here on my screen. I'm going to move it up a little bit so that it's above the floor. And right now it doesn't have my script to it. So again, I'm going to go back to my scripts, grab my character controller script, and just drag it on there. Let me set up. So now if I run, this will be generating different events. Let me bring my console back up here and see what is. This rigid body controller acts more like what you would expect and gives me the normal collision enter events. So now if I run and I go collide with the object here, I see first I fall down and bump the floor, and then I collide with the gem, and the gem collides with me. I get an on collision enter with both the character and the gem. Both are colliding with each other, and then every time I hit the gem, I get both of these events on both ends. And so that's one thing. The other object, you never get with the character controller, default one, you never get any sort of collision event on the other object. And here we get, as we would expect, a character on collision enter and a gem on collision enter are both run here. Now notice that these, I don't go through these, I bump into these objects. By default, my gem here, when I created it, it created a mesh of the cube. It also added a box collider, and this is used for detecting collisions and making sure I don't go right through it generally. If you import meshes from other sources, they might just come in as a mesh, and sometimes you'll have to add the box collider to them or some other sort of collider. So we need a collider with these objects. So anytime you create objects here, 3D objects, they'll have a collider built in, but if you're importing meshes from other locations, you might have to add a collider here. So now I've got this gem. Now I'm going to make some more gems around here. So I'm going to make this into a prefab. So I've got one gem here. I'm going to drag it over to my assets folder and drop, and it'll be changed into a prefab. It'll also show up as kind of a blue here now that it's a prefab. I'm going to rename this over here, gem prefab. And now with a prefab, now I can drag more of them onto my screen. And work with them. I have them here. I'm going to want to group these together in the collectibles. So I'm going to create an empty game object, call that game object collectibles, and just make sure all my objects are underneath that. Reorder these, maybe rename that. Okay, so I have my gems here under collectibles. This allows me to move them all together if I want, but just keep them, mainly I want to do it just to keep them organized. And now I can actually change these if I want. I can choose one of the gems and change some of the characteristics. I can make this gem spin faster than the other gems if I want. But they should all be this. Now some changes you make to these will break the connection to the prefab, and so right now if I make changes to the prefab, it'll change to all of these objects, which is what I want. So you'll watch, sometimes you'll get a warning where if you're making a change to some of these objects, it'll say it's going to break your connection to the prefab. So just watch this. You generally want to avoid that. So Now in my code, I want to, whenever I run into any of these prefabs, I want to collect it. I want to then actually destroy that object. But I have to check because I also collide with the floor and I don't want to destroy the floor or something like that. So my code for my character here, let's take a, I forgot to talk about triggers. Let's go back and talk about triggers really quick. We've just been doing this on collision enter, and that's what the code I'm seeing now is this on collision enter. But let's talk about triggers. We can go into our gem, and inside the collider there's a box that says is trigger. I can check this and then I'll get trigger events from this. But when I turn the triggers on, that means I don't get collisions for this. And in fact, I'll walk right through these objects. So now with triggers on, I can go right through these objects and pass right through them. And when I do, I get the trigger event. So here's what I'm seeing. I get a trigger event on both sides. The gem gives me a trigger event and the character gets a trigger event. Both of them are getting trigger events showing up. But again, I'm passing right through them. Now I can decide what I want. So if I'm going to go through and collect these, I could use either event. Especially if I'm going to destroy them, it doesn't really matter. I'm not going to be bouncing against them. But again, you've got to decide if it's something where you're interested in going right through them or if you're interested in stopping when you hit them. If you're using collisions, then you will collide with them. So I'm actually going to go into my gem. I'm going to disable triggers and we're just going to use the collision stuff. Here. So now I'll see collisions. Again, you'll either see one or the other depending on if you have trigger enabled. But now if I collide with an object, I get this on collision enter when I enter a collision. I want to destroy that game object. So I could just say destroy game object, but I only want to destroy the gems. I don't want to destroy other objects I collide with, like the floor. And so I couldn't check the game name. Like over here, we just said check the object's name, but like my gems have different names, and when you instantiate prefabs and stuff, they have some weird naming abilities. So what I'm going to do is add a tag to these. So besides names, you can also add tags. There's some built-in tags here, but I'm going to add a new tag, tags empty, and hit plus, and go and call this collectible. Save that. Now I'm going to go back to my gem since I created that tag, and now there should be this new collectible tag. So since I tagged the prefab, it should have tagged all of these. All of these are now tagged as collectibles. So now when I go into my code, I can change that. So I'm using this code where I'm just saying if collision.gameObject. So collision is the thing I'm bumping into. So I'm in the player, the character, and I'm colliding with this other collision object from that, or collision, object, and I can look and see what game object was attached to the collision. That's the other thing I've collided with. You look at the tag, and I can check if that tag is labeled collectible because that's what I tagged them, and if so, I can destroy that game object. Now you don't want to say destroy this. That will destroy the script, or even just collision. That will destroy the collision object. I want to make sure I destroy the game object associated with the collision of the other object. So I've got that set up here. It will do this. Again, you've got to watch now. This code is on the character, so I want to destroy the other object. If I put this code on the game object, I'd want to say destroy this game object. Okay, so I've got this. So now when I bump into, let's see, I've saved this. When I bump into any of these objects, they should disappear and I should collect them here. Maybe I want to keep track of the score or something like that. So I can also introduce a little variable. I can add a variable, and I could have this just as a private variable and call it gem score equal to 0 to start with. Oops, I need to make it an integer. And then down here I can display that. So I've added that gem score, and then whenever I collide with the gem, I'm going to increment the gem score, and I'm also just going to print this out. Eventually, we'll learn how to use the user interface to display things on the screen, but for now, I'm just going to log in that I collected the item and what the score is, and I'm going to, again, still going to destroy that item. So right now I have this on trigger and on character controller. Neither of these are doing anything or ever being used for this, but I'm just going to leave them here so that they're part of this code base. So now if I run this, I should be able to go around, collect gems, and it should tell me what my score is on my screen here, down here. So that talks about creating objects. Again, so I'm going to go back to the scripting stuff. We talked about the on collision, on trigger, and on collider, controller collider hit. I have links to all the document pages on those here. But also back to scripting overview, we did talk about creating objects here and destroying objects. So this is how we destroy an object, and talks a little bit about this and some issues with, remember, not to do destroy dot this. But let's talk a little bit about instantiating. Let's say we wanted to create an object, and that's with the instantiate command. So let's just leave breadcrumbs, give it ability to leave breadcrumbs as we go. So I'm going to go back into my character control, my character collect, that's my collect drop, and drop. So I'm going to add that. So I'm going to do this in my update event. So I'm pasted this code in here. I'm going to check when we push a button down. So now keyboard inputs here are mapped, so I can actually check for physical keys, but generally we avoid that, and Unity maps keys to keyboard events like fire and horizontal and vertical. So that allows us to handle both controllers and different kinds of controllers, and also keyboards and different types of keyboards and stuff like that. So in Unity, if I go into edit, let's see, project settings, input, it'll bring up the input manager here, and what I call different axes of input. And again, horizontal, vertical, mouse, X, Y. So the mouse, the left and right buttons A and D are all mapped to the horizontal things, and similarly the joystick controls are mapped to the horizontal things. And we're just going to use this fire one, so that's mapped to left control. It's also mapped to one of the buttons, joystick button 0 there. So again, we often try to use these axes in our code that are in the input manager. So I'm just going to say if get button down and just specify that one of these axes fire 1. So that'll be the left control. Then I'm going to do things. I'm just going to instantiate an object. So I'm just going to say instantiate. Now, what object do I want to instantiate? I want to do a prefab, and I want to reference that prefab from in here. One of the easier ways to connect prefabs together is to put a reference to it up here. So in my object here, I'm going to make a public game object and call it breadcrumb. And then down here, I'm just going to instantiate that breadcrumb object. So when I hit the fire button, it will instantiate that breadcrumb object. So now I'm going to go back here, run this, and see if this is going to work. Let me bring up my console. Let me do some debugging first, it looks like. Okay, fix my last parenthesis, and now I'm going to run this, and I should see an error. So I'm going to try to leave a breadcrumb by hitting left control. And I get this unassigned reference variable breadcrumb in character drop add has not been assigned a value. So let's look at what that means. So I defined it in the code here, breadcrumb is a game object, but I didn't specify what game object it should be. So over here, if I go to I'm using the rigid body controller. If I go to there and look at my code here, here's my script, and here's the breadcrumb object, and there's no game object assigned to this. So I'm going to create a game object for this. So I'm just going to, I don't have one created. I'm just going to quickly create a prefab. I'm going to create, let's create a sphere, resize it somewhat. I'm going to create a material for it. Okay, so I've created that. I'm going to make that, I'm going to give that a name. Actually, I'm going to just make it into a prefab and then give it a name there. So I'm going to drag that over here and call this breadcrumb prefab. So I've created this as a prefab, renamed it. I'm going to also delete it here, and so then I'm going to go into my rigid body controller, and when I script here, the breadcrumb object I want to create, I'm going to use this prefab I've just created. So now when I run this, I should be able to create and drop breadcrumbs behind me as I go. So if I hit some control and move around, it should drop these prefabs. Now, problem it's having is it's creating these prefabs, but they're all at the same location. It's not where I'm at. I can zoom out and see where I'm at, and the prefab so it is creating them is at the last place where I made this prefab. It's just putting it right back there, and that's not what I want. I want to change that slightly. So I want to set it to create where I am doing it. I also want to so I'm going to change this a little bit. Let's go in, and so when I instantiate this prefab, I then want to change its position. But after I instantiate it, I want to make sure I save a reference to it, and then I'm going to set its position here. So I'm going to do my instantiate here, but I'm going to save a pointer to it as a game object. Call it new crumb. So rather than just saying instantiate, I'm going to save the reference to it. And once I have that, I can say new crumb, and I would like to just say new crumb transform equals another transform, but transform is not something you can overwrite. It's a read-only object, but I can reset its position. So I have to say new crumb dot transform dot position. So in our objects, if I have an object here, it has a transform, and with that, in that it has a position. So that's what I'm accessing. It also has rotation. I'm not worried about the rotation at this point, just the position. So new crumb dot transform dot position. I'm going to set it to now. Game object refers to the game object that's attached to this object. In fact, let's type this in again. If I type in game object, it tells me the game object this component is attached to. So that's a little g game object. This game object is a type, is the game object type. This is the game object with the little g that I want. And then I want to go to transform dot position. Oops. Let's see if I can type properly. There. So that'll set the location, the position of the new game object I'm created to where I'm at. So now if I run this, let's zoom out a little bit here, and now I go. As I walk around and hit left control, it'll create objects as I move around. Let's see. Now I can't see them very well here. I can look back and see them, but they are there and being created behind me. So that's how we can instantiate game objects. Now I'm going to show you one more thing. We've been looking at these two controllers. Let's look quickly at the third person controller here. So I've been looking at first person controllers. I'm going to go into the third person controller, There's some prefabs. I don't want the AI one. I want this normal one. So again, I'm going to go in my rigid body one and disable that. I'm going to go to my third person controller, drag that out here. And this will add a mesh of someone called Ethan. He's built in fact, if I look in here, he's Ethan's body, his glasses, his skeletons are all part of this third person controller here. So Ethan's there. And I can walk around with Ethan. I'm going to now take that third person controller. I'm going to find under my assets my character controller stuff and drag it on Ethan. I need to find a empty spot on Ethan. Drag this on Ethan so that he's running the same script. Again, the breadcrumb I have to set up, so I'm going to drag that back and set that up again. And now I can walk around with Ethan. Ethan doesn't use the mouse point. He uses the arrow keys to turn and go forward and things like that. Now he walks. Now, he also doesn't have a built-in camera. He uses the main camera. And so I'm going to want to set this up. So I've got the main camera here. This is what I'm viewing everything out of. And I'm going to tie this into Ethan a little better. I want the main camera to be a child of Ethan. So as Ethan moves around, the main camera moves around. And then I also want to change the main camera so that it looks down on Ethan a little bit better and has a good view of Ethan. So I'm just going to move this camera around and rotate it. So I'm positioning the camera behind Ethan here. I'm going to also rotate it. So here's the view. The game view will show that view. I'm going to rotate it so that it's looking down a little bit on Ethan there. So now I can hopefully see, and again, I can change however I want this third party look, but I can see my third party character in front of me. And again, the camera is pointing at Ethan. So now I can run this. I noticed I did this all while I had it in play mode. You do this at times. Once you do a bunch of stuff in play mode, when you hit stop, it resets to where it was. So now I'm just going to have to redo it again. So try to remember not to do this in play mode. But now that I'm not in play mode, I'll redo this. Okay, so now I have, I think, the camera positioned a good spot, and so I get a good view of Ethan ahead of me. And now if I run this, I can drive Ethan around using the arrow keys. And I can, let's jump. I can leave these breadcrumbs as I go. So that walks us through instantiating objects, destroying objects. This first part of scripting gets you started in this material. The last thing I'm going to do is I've got a couple of prefabs here and a couple of scripts that aren't in folders. In my assets, I like to keep my asset folders or area nice and neat. So I'm going to make a prefab folder, and I'm going to make a scripting folder. And grab these and drag them into their corresponding folders. It's easy to get hundreds of objects in your assets folder before too long. So now I've got them a little better organized and I can find things quickly. Okay. Hope you enjoyed. Good luck on the assignment this week.